The sun rises slowly over the desert, casting long shadows across a landscape that has witnessed millennia. At an excavation site, a figure kneels in the sand, brush in hand, moving with the careful reverence of someone who knows they are touching time itself. Each stroke reveals a little more stone, carving, the edge of something that once mattered deeply to people who are now only whispers in the earth. Archaeology is often presented as a pure science, a discipline where evidence speaks for itself and truth emerges cleanly from the layers of sediment and time. We imagine archaeologists as detectives of the ancient world, piecing together puzzles with nothing but facts and reason. But like all human endeavors, archaeology is shaped by more than just the stones it uncovers. It is shaped by the people who interpret them, their training, their theories, their funding, and perhaps most critically, their need to fit new discoveries into frameworks that already exist. Picture the weight of a career built on certain assumptions. Imagine decades of research, publications, and teaching, all resting on a timeline that places the first great civilizations at a specific moment in history. Now imagine finding something that doesn't fit, a tool that appears too sophisticated for its supposed age, a structure aligned with astronomical precision centuries before such knowledge was thought to exist, a date that pushes human achievement back further than the textbooks allow. What happens then? The brush pauses. The archaeologist looks at the object emerging from the sand, and in that moment, a choice begins to take shape. Not necessarily a conscious conspiracy, but something quieter, a hesitation, a rationalization, a decision to wait for more evidence before challenging what everyone believes they know. This is where our journey begins, not in the grand halls of museums or the glossy pages of academic journals, but in that brief human moment of uncertainty, when what is found beneath the dust threatens the certainty built above it, when evidence whispers something different from consensus, when the official story begins to crack, not because archaeologists are hiding the truth, but because truth itself may be more complicated, more layered, and more carefully guarded than we ever imagined. The site is quiet now as the sun climbs higher. Tools are packed away, notes are made, and somewhere in those notes, a question lingers, unasked or unanswered, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to pursue it. To understand how history is told, we must first understand who tells it and how those stories are built, brick by careful brick, into the structures we call truth. Mainstream archaeology operates within a framework refined over centuries. It relies on stratigraphy, the study of soil layers, to establish relative dates. It uses radiocarbon dating, thermal luminescence, and other scientific methods to assign ages to organic materials in pottery. It cross-references artifacts with known cultures, comparing styles, materials, and techniques to place objects within established timelines. These methods are rigorous, tested, and largely reliable. They have given us a coherent narrative of human development, from simple hunter-gatherers to the first agricultural communities, from small settlements to the great civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and beyond. But coherence requires consensus. And consensus, by its nature, resists disruption. Academic archaeology is governed by peer review, a system in which researchers submit their findings to journals, where other experts evaluate the evidence and methodology before publication. This process ensures quality control. It filters out errors, exaggerations, and unfounded speculation. But it also creates a kind of intellectual pressure, a gravitational pull toward ideas that align with what is already accepted. Radical claims require extraordinary evidence, and even then, they may be met with skepticism, delay, or outright rejection. Funding plays a role as well. Archaeological digs are expensive. They require permits, equipment, teams of specialists, months or years of labor. Universities, government agencies, and private foundations provide the money, and they prefer projects that promise clear results, discoveries that will enhance museum collections. attract media attention, or advance well-defined research questions. A proposal to search for evidence of a lost civilization predating known history is less likely to receive support than one focused on a recognized site from an established period. Museums and institutions curate not only artifacts, but narratives. When a discovery is made, decisions must be made about what to display, how to label it, and what story to tell. These decisions are shaped by educational goals, public interest, and the need to present history in a way that is digestible and compelling. Ambiguity is rarely a selling point. Uncertainty does not fill exhibition halls. And so, even when questions remain, the story told to the public is often one of confidence and clarity. None of this is inherently sinister. It is simply how institutions function. Stability is valued over speculation. Caution is preferred to controversy. And in a discipline that prides itself on scientific rigor, the burden of proof is high, sometimes too high for ideas that challenge the foundation. Theories become facts when enough people agree. And once that agreement is reached, it becomes difficult to revise. Textbooks are written. Curricula are designed. Generations of students learn the timeline, memorize the dates, and carry those assumptions forward into their own careers. The official story, once written, takes on a life of its own, not because it is necessarily wrong, but because changing it requires more than evidence. It requires momentum. It requires courage. And it requires someone willing to risk everything to ask the question no one else dares to speak aloud. Meanwhile, in storage rooms and archives, artifacts sit in boxes waiting. Some are cataloged, some are studied, and some are simply set aside, not hidden, but deferred, waiting for the right time, the right technology, or the right archaeologist to look at them again with fresh eyes. The official timeline of human civilization is elegant in its simplicity. Agriculture emerged around 10,000 BCE. Writing appeared in Mesopotamia around 3,200 BCE. The Great Pyramids rose in Egypt roughly 4,500 years ago. Stonehenge was constructed in stages, beginning around 3,000 BCE. Each of these milestones is supported by evidence, and together they form a narrative of steady, incremental progress. But beneath that elegance, cracks have always existed. In the 1960s, archaeologists excavating Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey uncovered massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with intricate reliefs of animals. The site was older than Stonehenge, far older. Radiocarbon dating placed its construction at around 9,600 BCE, before the advent of agriculture, before pottery, before settled civilization as it was understood. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were supposedly hunter-gatherers, yet they had organized labor, advanced carving techniques, and a vision grand enough to move stones weighing many tons. The discovery was celebrated, but it was also unsettling. It pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible for pre-agricultural societies. It raised questions about social organization, belief systems, and the origins of monumental architecture. And it forced archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about the linear progression from simple to complex. Other anomalies followed. In the 1970s, researchers in South America began to seriously study the Nazca lines, enormous geoglyphs etched into the desert floor, some stretching for miles, depicting animals, geometric shapes, and lines that pointed toward distant mountains and celestial events. The precision required to create such images from the ground, without the ability to see them from above, suggested knowledge, and planning that seemed out of place for the Nazca culture's supposed level of technological development. In Japan, underwater formations off the coast of Yonaguni sparked debate. Discovered in the mid-1980s by a dive tour operator, the structures appeared to show carved steps, terraces, and right angles, features that suggested human modification. If they were indeed man-made, they would have been constructed during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower. Mainstream archaeology largely dismissed the site as a natural formation shaped by erosion and tectonic activity. But the debate never fully disappeared. Artifacts, too, have surfaced in places they shouldn't be. Stone tools found in contexts that predate accepted human migration timelines. Pottery styles appearing in regions they supposedly never reached. Maps from the medieval period that seem to depict coastlines only visible before glacial ice-melted coastlines that shouldn't have been known to exist. Each anomaly is met with explanation. Göbekli Tepe is now integrated into the narrative, though it remains an outlier. The Nazca lines are attributed to ritualistic purposes, their precision explained by careful planning and simple tools. Yonaguni is dismissed. The maps are called coincidences, copying errors, or imaginative reconstructions. And yet, the cracks remain. Not because the explanations are necessarily wrong, but because they sometimes feel strained like puzzle pieces, forced into place when they don't quite fit. The official story holds, but only with pressure applied at the edges. In universities and conferences, these anomalies are discussed quietly. They are footnotes in textbooks, curiosities mentioned in passing. They are not mysteries to be solved, but complications to be managed. And for most archaeologists, that is enough. The timeline stands. The narrative endures. But for a few those who linger over the cracks, who measure the angles of ancient stones with modern tools, who look at the dating reports and feel a faint unease, the questions grow louder. What if the timeline is incomplete? What if the progression wasn't as linear as we believe? What if some knowledge was lost, relearned, or inherited from something older? These are dangerous questions, and asking them comes with a price. To challenge the consensus in archaeology is not merely to propose a new idea. It is to risk one's credibility, one's career, and one's standing within a community that values stability and peer approval above all else. Consider the case of a young researcher who, after years of fieldwork, publishes findings suggesting that a particular site is significantly older than previously thought. The evidence is solid carbon dating, stratigraphy, comparative analysis. But the conclusion contradicts decades of established scholarship. Senior colleagues respond with skepticism. Reviewers question the methodology. Journals decline to publish follow-up papers. Grant applications are quietly rejected. It is not that the researcher is accused of fraud. It is subtler than that. Their work is described as premature, insufficiently supported, or in need of further corroboration. They are invited to fewer conferences. Their name is omitted from collaborative projects. And over time, their career stalls not because they were wrong, but because they dared to be different. This is the human side of science. For all its claims to objectivity, archaeology is practiced by people with mortgages, families, ambitions, and fears. A tenured professor at a prestigious university has spent decades building a reputation on a particular interpretation of ancient cultures. If new evidence emerges that undermines that interpretation, the professor faces a choice: embrace the uncertainty and risk appearing obsolete, or defend the old model and maintain their authority. Most choose the latter, not out of malice, but out of instinct. Academic careers are long and fragile. Funding is competitive. Positions are scarce. And in a field where respect is earned through slow, careful accumulation of evidence, a single controversial claim can undo years of work. There are cautionary tales whispered among graduate students and junior researchers. The professor who championed an unpopular theory and found themselves isolated at conferences. The archaeologist whose groundbreaking find was dismissed as misinterpretation, only to be quietly validated decades later too late to salvage their reputation. The researcher who left academia entirely, frustrated by the gatekeeping and the unwillingness to entertain ideas that didn't fit the prevailing narrative. These stories are not about villains and heroes. They are about incentives, institutions, and the invisible architecture of consensus. Science is a social process. It requires communication, collaboration, and trust. But those same mechanisms that ensure quality control can also suppress dissent. And so, many archaeologists learn to operate within the boundaries. They publish findings that align with accepted timelines. They frame their discoveries in language that reassures rather than challenges. They save their more radical ideas for private conversations, late-night musings, or retirement when the stakes are lower and the consequences less severe. This is not to say that archaeology never evolves. It does. Theories are revised, new methods are adopted, and the timeline shifts incrementally as more evidence accumulates. But the evolution is slow, cautious, and controlled. Revolutions are rare, and those who attempt to spark them often find perhaps similar devices existed but were lost to time, their bronze melted down and repurposed. Perhaps the knowledge required to build it was written in texts that burned with the Library of Alexandria. These explanations are plausible, but they rest on absence, on what we haven't found, rather than what we have. If early human settlements preferred coastal regions as modern ones, then vast amounts of archaeological evidence would now lie submerged beyond the reach of most excavation. Consider, too, the Younger Dryas Sudden, catastrophic cooling event around 10,800 BCE that interrupted the warming trend and plunged the planet back into near glacial conditions for over a millennium. Göbekli Tepe was dismissed as a natural hill until someone started digging. Entire Mayan cities lay invisible beneath rainforest canopy until LiDAR scans exposed them to the world. The question is not whether lost civilizations existed. The question is whether we have looked in the right places and whether we are willing to accept what we might find if we do. As the climate shifted, so too did memory. What was once certain became myth. What was once recorded became symbol. And what was once built became dust, waiting for the day when someone would ask if history began later than the past actually did. And sometimes, the stones themselves seem to contradict the stories we tell. The Great Pyramid of Giza is one of the most studied structures in human history. And yet, questions linger. The pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing over 70 tons. The internal chambers and passageways demonstrate an understanding of geometry and engineering that seems advanced for the supposed time period. And some researchers, looking at the same stones, see something more, a level of precision and planning that hints at knowledge beyond what the Bronze Age is thought to have possessed. Across the Atlantic, in the highlands of Peru, the site of Sacsayhuaman presents a similar puzzle. Massive stones, some weighing over 100 tons, are cut and fitted with such exactness that they have survived centuries of earthquakes without mortar. Traditional explanations point to Incan engineering, dating the construction to the 15th century CE. The Romans are credited with building the temple, but the foundation stones, known as the trilithon, may predate Roman occupation. And why were they cut so large in the first place, when smaller stones would have been easier to transport and work with? They suggest a sophistication of technique, a precision of execution, and a scale of ambition that seems mismatched with the tools and technologies their builders are supposed to have used. They describe what was done, but not always how it was achieved or why it was done in such an extravagant, precise, and enduring manner. That explain them. They do not answer questions. They simply exist, heavy and ancient, daring anyone who looks closely to wonder whether the builders knew something we have forgotten, or whether they inherited their knowledge from someone who came before. Tool marks that don't match the tools we think were used. One by one, these details are explained away, but together they form a pattern, a whisper in the stone, that something about the official story may still be missing. And between the layers we can raid, vast silences exist, gaps where entire chapters of human experience have simply vanished. Erosion is relentless. Wind and water wear down structures, smooth carvings, and scatter artifacts. A city built on a riverbank may be washed away in a single flood. Geological evidence suggests that around 5600 BCE, the rising Mediterranean breached a natural dam and flooded into what was then a freshwater lake, rapidly submerging thousands of square miles of land. Rock art from that period shows elephants, giraffes, and cattle species that could not survive in the arid landscape that exists today. Their settlements, if they built any, are now buried beneath sand, waiting for wind or excavation to expose them again. Consider the continental shelves' vast expanses of land that were above water during the Ice Age, when sea levels were much lower. Underwater archaeology is still in its infancy. Most of the ocean floor remains unexplored. But these gaps also mean that our picture of the past is incomplete. We see only what has survived, not what existed. We map only the landscapes we can access, not the ones hidden beneath water, ice, or sand. And in those silences, possibilities multiply. What if the progression of civilization was not as smooth as we imagine? It builds theories on evidence that exists, not on speculation about what might lie beyond reach. But as new technologies emerge, submarine drones, ground-penetrating radar, ice core drilling, the boundaries of the accessible continue to expand. The missing layers do not speak. In 1985, a dive instructor exploring the waters off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, discovered a series of massive stone formations on the seafloor. At first glance, they appeared natural step terraces, flat surfaces, right angles carved by tectonic forces and erosion. The depth of the structures, between 5 and 40 meters below the surface, suggested that, if they were man-made, they would have been built during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower. That would place their construction at least 10,000 years ago, possibly older. Debate erupted. Mainstream geologists argued that the formations were entirely natural, shaped by the region's tectonic activity and the layering of sedimentary rock. But others pointed to the precision of the angles, the symmetry of the terraces, and the presence of what appeared to be tool marks. The controversy remains unresolved. Most archaeologists dismiss Yonaguni as a natural formation, fascinating but not evidence of ancient construction. The findings remain disputed, criticized for lack of rigorous excavation and peer review. In the Mediterranean, near Alexandria, Egypt, underwater archaeologists have mapped extensive ruins of ancient harbor structures, submerged by earthquakes and rising water over the centuries. The question is not whether underwater ruins exist. They do. The question is how many more remain undiscovered and how far back in time they might reach. If human populations favored coastlines, and evidence suggests they did, then the oldest settlements, built when sea levels were 100 meters lower, are now inaccessible without advanced technology and funding. And so, beneath the waves, the past waits silent, submerged, and largely unexplored. Cities that may have existed before history began, swallowed by the rising water as the ice melted. A lost chapter of human experience, written in stone and sand, readable only to those willing to dive deep enough to look. But another possibility emerges, that what we think of as the beginning of civilization may simply be the beginning of what survived, and that the true beginning lies deeper beneath the sea, beneath the sand, beneath layers of time we have only just begun to penetrate. Astronomy appears surprisingly early in human history. The ancient Egyptians aligned their pyramids with the stars. The Maya calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of modern accuracy. Stonehenge tracked the solstices. These accomplishments are celebrated, but they also raise a question. How did ancient peoples, without telescopes or computers, achieve such precision? The standard explanation is that they observed, recorded, and refined their knowledge over generations. By watching the sky night after night, year after year, they learned the patterns of celestial movement. They noticed that certain stars rose at the same time each year, marking the seasons. They tracked the moon's phases. They recognized eclipses as predictable events rather than divine omens. This explanation is plausible, but it assumes that each civilization began from scratch, independently developing the same knowledge. It assumes that there was no earlier source, no inherited framework, no shared legacy of observation passed down from a time before written records. What if astronomy was older than we think? What if the knowledge encoded in stone circles and temple alignments was not discovered by the people who built them? Mythology offers clues. How they acquired this knowledge remains debated contact with modern astronomers, oral traditions of extraordinary accuracy, or something else. The Vedic texts of India contain references to vast cycles of time and cosmic architecture. The Papal Vu of the Maya speaks of previous worlds and ages, destroyed and renewed. These are dismissed as myth-poetic imagination, religious symbolism. But what if they are also memory? Mathematics, too, appears unexpectedly. The ancient Egyptians calculated pi and constructed geometric forms with impressive accuracy. The builders of megalithic sites used units of measurement and proportional relationships that suggest deliberate, systematic planning. But they do suggest that knowledge was more widespread, more sophisticated, and more carefully transmitted than we often acknowledge. And they hint at the possibility that some of this knowledge was not invented in isolation, but passed down, fragmented, distorted, but preserved from a time we no longer remember. The Greeks understood heliocentrism before it was suppressed by geocentric dogma. The ancient Chinese invented gunpowder, the compass, and printing. And the sea, which had been held captive in frozen form, returned to liquid flooding coastlines, drowning valleys, and reshaping a map of the world. Human populations, if they had begun to organize into settled communities, would have been scattered, decimated, or forced to adapt rapidly. What was once land is now ocean floor. What was once fertile is now desert. What was once habitable is now ice. And with each transformation, evidence of human presence is buried, dissolved, or scattered beyond recognition. Consider the flooding of the Mediterranean basin. Geological evidence suggests that around 5.3 million years ago, the Mediterranean was a dry valley cut off from the Atlantic. Then, a natural barrier broke, and the ocean poured in a waterfall of unimaginable scale, filling the basin in perhaps as little as 2 years. Consider the drowning of Doggerland, a landmass that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. During the Ice Age, it was a low-lying plain, rich in resources, home to hunter-gatherer communities. As the ice melted, the sea rose, and Doggerland slowly submerged. Consider the desertification of the Sahara. 10,000 years ago, it was green. Lakes, rivers, grasslands, and human settlements thrived. As the climate shifted and rainfall decreased, the region dried. People migrated, lakes evaporated, and within a few thousand years, the Sahara became the inhospitable desert it is today. These are not anomalies. They are the norm. Climate change is constant, and its effects are profound. It rewrites geography. And it erases history. But what if, before the floods, before the deserts, before the ice melted and the sea rose, there were people organized, knowledgeable, capable? What if they built cities on coastlines now submerged? What if they developed agriculture, astronomy, and architecture, only to see their achievements scattered by catastrophe? The survivors would flee. They would carry what they could: stories, techniques, fragments of knowledge. They would settle in new lands, among people who had not experienced the same disasters, and they would try to rebuild. But memory is fragile. Without writing, without institutions, without continuity, knowledge degrades. What was once precise becomes approximate. What was once history becomes myth. And yet the story persists. Flood myths appear in nearly every ancient culture: Sumerian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Chinese, Native American. But what if they are memory distorted by time, but rooted in a real global event? The evidence is circumstantial, but it is accumulating. It is filled with the ghosts of worlds that came before worlds, that built, dreamed, and vanished, leaving only stone, story, and the faint, uneasy sense that history is longer and more complex than we have been taught. They are institutions of education, preservation, and power, and like all institutions, they must choose what to display, what to store, and what to say. The narrative is confident. The timeline is clear. The story is coherent. Some are duplicates, considered less important than the pieces on display. Some are fragments, too incomplete to interpret. And some are anomalies, objects that don't fit neatly into the established narrative, that raise questions without offering easy answers. These are not hidden in the sinister sense. They are simply deferred. Resources are finite. Curators must prioritize. Some researchers have suggested it functioned as a primitive galvanic cell, capable of generating a small electric current. Others dismiss the idea, arguing that it was simply a storage vessel, and that the interpretation as a battery is speculative and anachronistic. The artifact exists. It is displayed in museums, but its function remains contested, and no definitive consensus has emerged. So, it sits in ambiguity, a curiosity, not a revelation. But the precision of certain details remains unsettling to those who study it closely. The map is acknowledged, it is studied, but it is not integrated into the narrative of exploration and discovery in a way that challenges the established timeline. A clear, compelling narrative is more effective than a tangle of competing theories and unresolved questions. But the process of revision is slow. It requires consensus. And consensus requires not just evidence, but momentum, enough researchers willing to challenge the old model, enough funding to support new investigations, and enough institutional courage to revise the labels, rewrite the textbooks, and admit that what was once certain is now uncertain. Dissertations are evaluated based on their adherence to methodological rigor and their contribution to existing scholarship. Funding agencies prefer projects with clear, achievable goals. Risk is minimized, speculation is discouraged, and the result is a discipline that advances cautiously, refining what is known rather than exploring what is unknown. But what if silence is not always denial? What if it is sometimes fear of being wrong, fear of damaging one's reputation, fear of opening a debate that cannot be controlled? What if some gatekeepers know that the timeline is incomplete, that the evidence is ambiguous, but choose to wait rather than speak? Centuries earlier, the Catholic Church held the keys to knowledge, deciding what could be taught, what could be questioned, and what must be believed. Today, no inquisition threatens archaeologists, but the mechanisms of control are subtler peer review, funding, reputation. In the 1990s, a construction project in Turkey unearthed a series of stone structures near the village of Derinkuyu. Initial excavations revealed a complex network of underground tunnels, chambers, and ventilation shafts, an ancient subterranean city capable of housing thousands of people. The site was not unknown. Derinkuyu and other underground cities in Cappadocia had been documented for decades, attributed to early Christian communities seeking refuge from persecution. But this new section appeared older, deeper, and more extensive than expected. Dating was difficult, but some researchers suggested it might predate the accepted timeline by centuries, possibly millennia. Excavation continued for several months. Artifacts were removed, photographs were taken, and preliminary reports were filed. Then, abruptly, the site was backfilled. Tons of earth were poured back into the excavation. The tunnels were sealed, and the construction project resumed. Official explanations were mundane. The site was deemed structurally unstable, a danger to workers and visitors. Preserving it would be costly, and the artifacts recovered were sufficient for study. No further excavation was necessary. No definitive evidence supports these claims. The official record is clear. The site was documented, studied, and reburied for practical reasons. The artifacts are stored, accessible to researchers who request permission. There is no cover-up, no conspiracy, no suppression of inconvenient truths. And yet, the site remains buried. The tunnels are once again filled with earth, and the questions it raised about the age, purpose, and builders of the deepest chambers remain unanswered, deferred to a future excavation that may never come. This is not unique. Around the world, archaeological sites are discovered, partially excavated, and then left either due to lack of funding, political instability, environmental concerns, or simply because the priorities of the moment shift. Some are protected, fenced off, and studied gradually over decades. Others are forgotten, covered again by time, waiting for someone to remember. But when a site is reburied deliberately, quickly, and without full publication of findings, it sparks speculation. not because the official explanations are necessarily false, but because they are incomplete. And in the absence of complete information, imagination fills the gaps. Was Derintu simply too unstable to preserve? Or was it too unsettling a reminder that the past is deeper, older, and more complex than the timeline allows? Was it reburied to protect it, or to protect the narrative? The stones know, but they are buried again, and they do not speak. And so, another layer is added to the silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence of choice. A decision made, a site sealed, and a story left unfinished. Every culture tells stories of the time before, of golden ages and fallen empires, of gods who walked the earth, of floods that drowned the world, of fires that burned the sky. These stories are woven into scripture, sung in epics, carved into stone, and passed from generation to generation. Mainstream scholarship treats them as mythology-symbolic narratives created to explain natural phenomena, teach moral lessons, or legitimize political authority. They are not history, but literature, not fact, but metaphor. But what if they are both? The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories in human history, describes a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. A man named Utnapishtim builds a boat, saves his family and animals, and survives. The story predates the biblical account of Noah by over a millennium, and similar flood myths appear in nearly every ancient culture: Hindu, Greek, Chinese, Aztec, Polynesian. The consistency is striking. The details vary. Different gods, different heroes, different boats, but the core event is the same: a catastrophic flood, a few survivors, and the renewal of the world. Scholars explain this as a universal response to local flooding events, or as a shared archetype reflecting human fear of water. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a comet struck the Earth around 12,800 years ago, triggering widespread fires, climate disruption, and the extinction of megafauna. The hypothesis is controversial, and evidence remains debated. But if such an event occurred, it would have been catastrophic, visible from across the globe, seared into the collective memory of any survivors. And indeed, myths speak of sky fires, falling stars, and ages destroyed by flame. The Hopi speak of previous worlds that were destroyed. The Hindus describe cycles of creation and destruction. The Norse tell of Ragnarok, a final battle and cosmic reset. Are these metaphors for spiritual truths, or are they memories of real cyclic catastrophes that reshape the world? What if the suppression is not a conspiracy, but a condition? Not a deliberate cover-up, but a structural inability to speak? Imagine an archaeologist who has spent decades building a career on a particular interpretation of ancient history. They have published papers, written textbooks, and trained students. Their reputation is built on the timeline they helped establish. Now imagine they discover evidence that contradicts that timeline, something that suggests an earlier date, a more advanced technology, or a lost civilization. To publish this evidence would be to undermine their own life's work. It would invite criticism, skepticism, and challenges from colleagues who have no reason to accept a radical revision. It would jeopardize future funding, damage relationships, and cast doubt on everything they have taught. And so they hesitate, not because they are dishonest, but because they are human. They rationalize. They look for alternative explanations. They decide that more evidence is needed before drawing conclusions. They set the anomaly aside, not hidden, but deferred. This is not unique to one individual. It is systemic. Entire institutions operate this way. Academic departments, museums, and funding agencies all have incentives to preserve the existing framework. Revolutions are rare because they are disruptive. And disruption, in a discipline that values stability and rigor, is discouraged. But what if some researchers do know? What if, in private conversations, late-night discussions, or unpublished notes, they acknowledge the cracks in the narrative. What if they see the anomalies, recognize the inconsistencies, but choose not to speak publicly because the cost is too high, the evidence is not yet definitive, or the timing is not right? This is not conspiracy in the traditional sense. There is no secret meeting where archaeologists agree to hide the truth. There is no shadowy organization suppressing evidence. There is simply inertia, the weight of consensus, the gravity of reputation, and the quiet, collective agreement to wait until the ground is firmer before stepping forward. And in that waiting, time passes. Careers end. Evidence remains unpublished. And the official story continues, not because it is necessarily correct, but because no one with sufficient authority has yet been willing to challenge it. There is precedent for this. Continental drift was proposed by Alfred Wegener in 1912, but it was dismissed by mainstream geologists for decades. The evidence was there, matching fossils, geological formations, and coastlines, but the mechanism was unclear, and the idea seemed too radical. It was not until the 1960s, when new technology revealed seafloor spreading, that plate tectonics became accepted. Wegener died in 1930, his theory vindicated long after his death. Heliocentrism was suppressed not only by the church, but by scientific consensus. Geocentric models were elegant, mathematically functional, and deeply embedded in both religious and academic thought. Galileo's observations threatened that structure, and he paid the price not because the evidence was wrong, but because the system was not ready to accept it. Archaeology is not physics. The stakes are lower, but the dynamics are similar. A discipline built on careful, incremental progress resists sudden shifts, and those who attempt to force those shifts often find themselves isolated, marginalized, or forgotten. But what if the silence is breaking? What if new technologies, LiDAR, satellite imaging, underwater sonar, genetic analysis, are revealing evidence that can no longer be ignored? What if the timeline is already beginning to shift, quietly, incrementally, as more data accumulates and younger researchers, less invested in the old models, start asking new questions? The truth may not be hidden. It may simply be delayed waiting for the moment when enough people are ready to see it, when enough evidence has accumulated to force a revision, and when the institutional structures that govern archaeology are willing to absorb the disruption. In the meantime, the past waits, the stones endure, and the archaeologists caught between certainty and doubt, between career and curiosity, continue their work, brushing dust from ancient surfaces, wondering if what they are uncovering is the full story or only the beginning. Stone outlasts certainty. Long after theories have been revised, textbooks rewritten, and careers forgotten, the structures remain. The pyramids still stand on the Giza Plateau. Stonehenge still marks the solstices. The great walls of Sacsayhuaman still resist earthquakes, and the stones themselves silent, patient, indifferent, wait for the next generation to look at them with fresh eyes and ask new questions. The past does not argue. It does not defend itself. It simply exists, heavy and enduring, offering evidence to anyone willing to observe without preconception. Every age interprets the past through its own lens. The Victorians saw ancient Egypt as a mystical, exotic civilization, full of curses and secrets. The 20th century saw it as a triumph of human engineering and organization, a testament to labor and ingenuity. The 21st century is beginning to see it as something more complex, a society that may have inherited knowledge, techniques, and traditions from predecessors whose names we do not know. Each interpretation is shaped by the tools available, the questions asked, and the assumptions brought to the evidence. And each, in turn, is provisional, subject to revision as new evidence emerges and new technologies allow us to see what was previously hidden. LiDAR has revealed entire Mayan cities beneath jungle canopy, structures invisible from the ground or even from the air with traditional photography. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped buried chambers and foundations without excavation. Satellite imagery has identified ancient roads, canals, and settlements in deserts and grasslands. Genetic analysis has traced migrations, relationships, and population movements with precision impossible just decades ago. The tools are improving, the data is accumulating, and the timeline is shifting slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. Göbekli Tepe pushed the origins of monumental architecture back by thousands of years. Discoveries in the Americas have extended the timeline of human presence far earlier than once believed. Underwater archaeology is beginning to map submerged coastlines and structures, and each discovery adds nuance, complexity, and uncertainty to the story we thought we knew. The past is not fixed. It is a living question, and the stones those silent witnesses continue to watch as we attempt to answer it. They do not judge. They do not hurry us. They simply wait, knowing that they will outlast our theories, our institutions, and our certainties. They have seen empires rise and fall. They have watched climates shift, seas rise, and deserts bloom and die. They have witnessed the slow, relentless passage of time, and they know that what we believe today will seem quaint, incomplete, or naive to those who come after. But they also know that some truths endure, that human ingenuity is ancient, that knowledge can be lost and rediscovered, that civilizations are fragile, but their works carved into stone can survive long after the people who built them are forgotten. And perhaps, in their silent endurance, the stones offer a lesson that certainty is temporary, but curiosity is timeless, that the past is not a closed book, but an ongoing conversation, and that every generation has the opportunity and the responsibility to look at the evidence again, to question what has been accepted, and to imagine what might have been. The excavation site is quiet now. The sun has moved across the sky, casting long shadows once more. Tools are packed away, notes are filed, and the stone, partially uncovered, rests in the sand waiting for tomorrow, when the work will resume. Waiting, as it has always waited, for the next hand to brush away the dust and ask, what if? Night falls on the desert. The excavation site, so full of activity during the day, now lies silent beneath a sky filled with stars. The same stars that ancient peoples watched, charted, and revered. The same sky that has turned slowly overhead for millennia, indifferent to the civilizations that rise and fall beneath it. A figure stands at the edge of the dig, looking out across the sand. Somewhere beneath this landscape, buried under centuries of sediment and silence, lies evidence of lives lived, knowledge accumulated, and stories told. Some of that evidence will be found. Some will remain hidden forever. And some, perhaps, is already known, held in storage, deferred in publication, or whispered in conversations that never make it into journals. But the story is not over. It has never been over, because history is not a finished text, carefully bound and shelved. It is an open question, constantly being rewritten as new evidence emerges and old certainties crumble. The archaeologist kneels again, brushing sand from a fragment of stone. The carving is worn, barely visible. It might mean nothing, or it might be a clue, a small piece of a much larger puzzle, waiting for someone patient enough to see it. This is the nature of archaeology. It is not about finding answers. It is about asking questions. It is about recognizing that every discovery reveals as much mystery as it resolves. It is about understanding that the past is vast, complex, and only partially visible, like an iceberg, with most of its mass hidden beneath the surface. And so, the work continues. Not because the truth is easy to find, but because it is worth seeking. Not because the timeline is settled, but because it never will be. Not because archaeologists know everything, but because they know they don't. And that humility, that openness to uncertainty, is what drives the discipline forward. Perhaps some truths are delayed. Perhaps some evidence is set aside. Perhaps some questions are left unasked, not out of conspiracy, but out of caution. But delay is not denial. Silence is not suppression. And the past, patient and enduring, waits for the moment when the right person, with the right tools and the right courage, will look at the evidence again and see what others missed. The stars turn slowly overhead. The desert is vast. And somewhere, beneath the sand, beneath the water, beneath layers of time, and forgetting, the past is still watching, waiting for the next brave hand to turn the page. If this journey has sparked your curiosity, if you found yourself wondering what other mysteries lie buried beneath certainty, consider continuing the exploration. The past is not closed. The questions are not answered. And the story, our story, is still being written.